So this is sort of a big part of where the Neoplatonic school comes from, is this language divide. This is important for us just in terms of the whole basic ideas of invocation, evocation, or particularly for evocation, because that concept doesn't exist without that divide. Because the Neoplatonic school was the first kind of ones they were coming up saying, okay, well, you know, there's this world down here, and then we have the world of forms, where there's the pure form of everything that's a completely idealized reality. And the whole concept of an idealized reality would have been incomprehensible in that harmonious sort of concept of the liminal space that we saw in what is traditionally understood as the pre-modern world. And I just think we are less aware of exactly how that is integrated into our lives and reacting for it. So what I would encourage people to do, because the more you think about, okay, like, I've got this idea, or I have this desire, or I have this situation that I want to, I've got an annoying coworker, so I'm just going to like try to banish him very quickly. And the more you like regularly incorporate that stuff, the more you come to live in that world, and just the more straight up effective these rituals are. And like I say, this is basic stuff, but I think that the principles behind it are something that we always clearly look at. Sometimes the most basic things are very deceptive in the ideas that they contain. And I think once you start kind of learning to think in terms of the pentagram and the hexagram, it reveals a lot about A, how you're interacting with the world around you, and B, about your own personal desires, how you categorize things. And this is really important, particularly for Thelema, because the idea is supposed to be we're trying to discover our true will. And that's not something that you just like know or just come up with, pull out of your ass. Like, it doesn't work that way. It takes a long time to really come to a definite idea of that, because, and particularly, we live in an environment where we are surrounded by completely manufactured desires from advertising and stuff like that. We have certain ideas of what success is, of what, you know, a good life is, that don't necessarily jive with what we actually want. And sometimes it's very difficult to separate that, because people are under tremendous social pressure to live up to a particular idea of, you know, what is a good life, what is a successful life. This is for me personally. I always find it's funny when I have someone in my home, because my home is set up completely to do this, or to write, or play music. You know, like I don't have a couch. I have no need for a couch. Why would I have a couch? Like, one chair. That's all that's required of me, because that's what I'm using this space for. I could go to the effort to set it up to look like everyone else's living room, but then if I did that, then you know, that would interfere with what I actually want to do and what I actually want. But it makes people uncomfortable when they're in that space, because it's not what they're used to being surrounded with when they're in someone's home. Pardon me. So really, we have to learn to chuck a lot of that, and that's really easier said than done. I mean, we'd all like to think that we're so independent and so set apart from the crowd or whatever, but the fact is, human beings are hardwired to seek approval from others. It's a big part of our psychological process. It's our social programming. It's all these things. And that takes a lot of work to undo. It's not something that you permanently fix or permanently get rid of. Just like the true will isn't something that you permanently set out and define, and it's like, okay, well, now I know my true will. It's all figured out. Now I know my desires, and the work is over, and I can, you know, lay on the beach and drink margaritas all day and fuck these rituals, because why should I even bother doing this anymore? I'm finished. Like, there's no end point to any of this work, just because the world around us is constantly going to be working to implant more new desires that aren't co-harmonious with what we're doing. And the true will is an evolving thing. It is a direction, and it is, I know it's kind of a cliched metaphor, but it is valuable to think of it as a path that you're on, because if you are walking on a path and you're consistently walking on that path, it's not going to be the same thing every day. You're going to come across new stuff. And I think that this is, because it's very deceptively comforting to think that we're doing all this really hard work, because I mean, this stuff is really hard work, and it's really consistent work. It's really comforting to think that someday we're just going to be done. We can go on to something else, but it doesn't really work that way. What else did I want to say? Okay, I want to talk briefly in terms of invocation about just the basic difference between, because we talked about the pentagram ritual and the hexagram ritual, which essentially involve classifying elements and planets and so on and so forth. This gets a little more complicated when you're dealing with actual entities, particularly because there is a tendency, I think, to over-rely on a one-to-one classification of particularly the pagan gods, whereas, we like to think, okay, well, this is the goddess Ishtar, she is associated with Venus, or, this is the god Horus, he's associated with Mars, and whereas in reality, what planetary hexagrams, what kind of elemental planetary energy we want to establish in our rituals has a lot to do with the aspect of the god, or what we want to get out of the god, more so than actually like a strict one-to-one of that energy. I mean, like Ishtar, for example, she's a perfect example. She was the central goddess of Babylonian culture for a long time, so it wouldn't be inappropriate to use Jupiter or the sun to invoke her like that. Then again, she's also a goddess of war, so it wouldn't be inappropriate to use Mars to invoke her like that. Then again, she's also a goddess of sex, so it's not inappropriate to use Venus to invoke her like that. And really, depending on why we want to have this conversation, why we want to have the presence of this entity, and what we want to use with that energy, that's how we kind of decide how we work out the planetary stuff in particular. And I would say that has more to do with the hexagram ritual and planetary invocations than it does in elemental rituals. One of the big mistakes that's very easy to make is to create a sense of elemental imbalance by specifically just using one pentagram. I mean, even if I was going for a pure elemental spirit, like one of the old Greek spirits or something like that, I always personally will invoke all 4 elements before doing the greater ritual of that particular element, just so you have some kind of foundation. I mean, there's a reason these things are divided into 4. That's our solid number. Those are the solid pillars. So we can stand on that foundation and then work to invoke something higher. But I think it's important to have that foundation, because if you focus too much on one energy, you just naturally create an imbalance. An imbalance is something that you never want. Crowley uses the analogy of riding a bike to discuss this. Just, you can't, if you go too slow, or you just, go in one direction, then your bike's going to fall down. You got to go fast. And actually, the faster you're riding, the more solidly you are set on that path, the more progress you're making. Because otherwise, if you slow down, you wobble and you fall, essentially. And that, I think, is a very apt analogy. Everyone has at one point or another fallen into a rut in their life, I'm sure. Like, we've all had that experience of just kind of, this is too much of the same. And these things are really a way to shake you out of that. And sometimes it can be very difficult to do. But the fact of the matter is, I find even when I have a very negative experience with, for example, a ceremonial evocation, some of which I've had recently, so those are very fresh in my mind, just the fact that something happened, even if it was really scary or really negative, is incentive to continue and do more, because you realize, okay, one way or another, this is working. Whereas if you're just banishing or just doing simple invocations, like just doing a pentagram ritual and stuff like that, sometimes it's hard to know if you're getting a result. It's like, when Crowley says that when we banish, we should have a feeling of cleanliness, and when we invoke, we should have a feeling of holiness. It's like, I don't know, do I feel more holy than yesterday? It's hard to tell. Let me get out my holy meter. It's very difficult to pin that down, whereas if you're trying to contact a spirit, you kind of know right away. Either you talked to something or you didn't. Either something showed up or it didn't. One of those two things happens, so you kind of know whether you got a result. When we do evocations, technically, usually we're doing it for a reason. We want something. And then, we know when we got a result. I can think of my most recent failed evocation was just pretty straightforward. There were a lot of promises made to me, but I had to do certain things before a certain time. And I kind of wanted to confirm that the spirit actually knew what it's talking about and capable of doing what it said it was going to do. So I asked them, what's gonna be the score in the Giants game on Sunday? And I got an answer which was completely wrong. So I'm just like, okay, fuck you, I'm not doing this. You can't even tell me the outcome of a football game. How are you supposed to be able to do all this other stuff that you're claiming you're able to do? And that's And I really do encourage people when they're communicating with spiritual entities to do stuff like that. Just like an easily verifiable question. Like something that you can concretely tell this happened and that happened, or whatever. Because that's a valuable thing to have. And often, even if it's nothing related to what you actually want from the ritual itself, if the entity claims to have this information and have these abilities, it should be able to give you that information. Just reasonably, that's what you would expect. Because